What's going on, everybody? It's your boy, That Guy Mile High, tuning back in for another reaction. Shout out to Scary Interesting for this video called Girl Found Adrift Tells Horrifying Story. That's just terrifying to be just adrift in the ocean and whatnot. So we gonna jump into that and see what that was all about. But before we do that, we got to give a big shout out to all the members. Shout out to Jamal, Jeffries, Holla Girl, Taylor, Funny Farm, Jordan, Christy, Holla Boy, Marla, Marie, Diesel, Tammy, Nick, Creatively Insane, Carrie, Ryan, Nicole, Aaron, Mama Dukes, Misty Summers, Lynn Willow, Driver Thoughts, Lynn, Amy Jane Doe, Liz Nugget, My Hood Life, and Gary Willis. Gang, gang, gang. Shout out to you guys, man. Appreciate you guys for being members. If you want to get personal shout outs in the videos, all the lives, all that good jazz, take advantage of some perks, think about hitting that join button down below. Got 3 different options to choose from. If not, just do the free 99 option. Subscribe, bell notification, help us hit 100K today. You dig what I'm saying? All right, so let's go ahead and jump into this right now and hear this crazy story. Let's go.
On November 14th, 1961, a tanker ship found decorated war veteran Major Julian Harvey floating in a small life raft off the coast of Florida following the sinking of the sailboat, the Bluebell. 3 days later, another life raft was spotted by a different ship that would completely change everything. Viewer discretion is advised.
Oh, snaps. I like that little sound. Beat that they chose.
On November
for this
14th,
intro.
1961, a tanker ship known as the Gulf Lion entered the Northwest Providence Channel off the coast of Florida on the way to Nassau. Just after lunch, some of the crew members on the tanker spotted a small boat off in the distance getting thrashed around in the rough waters of the Gulf Stream. On it, a man was standing and waving wildly, trying desperately to get their attention. The Gulf Lion adjusted their course to rendezvous with the boat, and as they approached, they realized it was actually 2 boats, a dinghy and a small rubber life raft tied to it. The man that had been waving was none other than the highly decorated Army pilot Julian Harvey. Born on March 1st, 1917, Harvey was tall and rugged and had sun-bleached hair, and in his years of service, the charismatic pilot had flown 29 combat missions over Europe in World War II, and then later 114 missions in the Korean War.
Damn.
He had even flown the infamous
decorated.
B-24 bomber known as the Ellie Mae on its final flight. Finally medically discharged in 1958, Harvey was stammering badly as he explained to the tanker crew how he got there. In the raft beside him was 7-year-old Renee Duperrault. She was wearing red shorts and a green shirt, and she was unfortunately deceased. The tanker continued on to New Providence Island, where they dropped Harvey off, and then he gave an official statement to police about what happened. In October of 1961, a Florida businessman hired Harvey and his wife, Mary Dean, to crew his 60-foot sailboat, the Bluebell. Their job would be to take tourists on a private ocean vacation on the ship, and in exchange, they would not only get to live on the boat, but would be paid a salary of $300 a month. Then in November, they got their first clients, the Duperrault family from Wisconsin. The husband, Arthur, was a successful optometrist, and with him would be his wife, Jean, and their 3 kids, 14-year-old Brian, 11-year-old Terry Jo, and 7-year-old Renee. The family paid $515 for the entire week-long trip that would take them to the islands off the coast of Florida. After leaving from where the Bluebell was moored along the Florida coast, the trip started off as the perfect vacation. The owner of the boat equipped it with twice as much safety gear as was required by the Coast Guard, and the weather was much better than the freezing November in Wisconsin. Along the way, the family had a wonderful time swimming in the crystal clear water, the kids enjoyed the beach, and the parents hung out with Harvey and Mary Dean, who they happened to get along with very well. When they were sailing, Harvey let Arthur steer the boat, and throughout the day, Mary Dean, who was an excellent cook, made food for everyone. On the final day of their trip, they were docked in the Bahamas and planned to make the overnight trip back to Fort Lauderdale to arrive on the 14th of November. At 5 p.m. on the 13th, they untied from the dock and set sail across the open water once again to finally bring an end to their perfect vacation. Then at around 11 p.m., a sudden squall rocked the boat, and the 20-knot winds and the gusts of even higher snapped the main mast. The broken mast then slammed down like a telephone pole through the hull of the boat and crushed Mary Dean. Harvey ran below deck to get cable cutters to cut the sails loose and realized that the mast had also pierced the fuel line, so highly flammable liquid was leaking everywhere. When he climbed back on deck, the helm was already engulfed in flames, making it impossible for him to send out an SOS. At this point, the boat also started to sink as it took on massive amounts of water. Realizing that the situation was hopeless, Harvey launched the dinghy and then started to blow up the 4-man life raft after that. In all of the commotion, the Duperraults had come up on deck and out of fear of being burned alive, jumped into the water, hoping Harvey would bring the boats to them. Harvey quickly launched the dinghy and raft and rowed it clear of the sinking ship and then started calling out for the family. But in the wind and rain and waves, he couldn't hear anyone calling back. Despite looking for them, he only managed to find 7-year-old Renee. She was floating face down, and it was clear she had drowned by the time he pulled her into the boat.
That is sad,
Now floating
bro.
aimlessly after witnessing his wife's death and the death of an entire family, Harvey just had to hope someone saw him before he succumbed to the elements. Following his statement, a search was immediately launched in the hopes that the family might still be floating out there somewhere. Unfortunately, the Bluebell had sunk in one of the deepest stretches of water in that area at around 900 feet deep. This would make it difficult, if not impossible, to recover any of the wreckage. Harvey was taken to a hotel where he stayed the night in the Bahamas, and then he flew back to Miami the following day, where he checked into another hotel. Over the next several days, he spoke to the Coast Guard at even greater length and gave as much information as he could to convey to friends and family of the deceased. Then on November 17th, so 3 days after the Bluebell sank, a watch officer on a Greek freighter spotted a tiny life raft in the Atlantic Ocean. On the raft was a young, blonde-haired girl. She was horribly dehydrated and sunburnt, and she was barely able to hoarsely give them her name, Terry Jo, before passing out. 11-year-old Terry Jo was then helicoptered to a hospital in Miami to recover after spending over 80 hours in a raft so small she couldn't even lie down. She was literally on the verge of death when they found her. Shortly following her discovery, Harvey was called back in to let him know the news and ask him some follow-up questions about how she might have survived. Harvey exclaimed that that was wonderful and went on to explain that he was very surprised she had actually survived. The life raft that she was in was tied to the roof of the cabin, and he figured there was no way she could have launched the boat on her own. Thankfully, he was mistaken. Somehow she had managed to survive long enough to grab a hold of the raft and free it from the cabin. And thankfully, they wouldn't have to guess exactly how it happened. They could just wait until Terry Jo was well enough, and then they could ask her how exactly she managed to survive the sinking of the Bluebell. Following the conversation, Harvey excused himself because he had arranged to make some phone calls to his wife's relatives. Then he gave the detectives an address that they could contact him at, and then at around 10:30 a.m., he drove back to his hotel. A couple of hours later, a housekeeper entered the room rented to a man named John Monroe. After walking through the door, she noticed that there was blood everywhere. Initially, she noticed it on the ends of the sheet on the bed, but realized that it was originating from all the way over in the bathroom. She immediately went to get the hotel manager, who then knocked on the bathroom door. When there was no answer, he slowly opened the door to find that there was blood everywhere. It was smeared all over the walls and the floor, and in the middle of all the blood was John Monroe, slumped over on the tile. On the back of the toilet were two pictures. One was of Mary Dean, and the other was Lance Harvey, son of Julian Harvey. Police were called to investigate, and one of the detectives happened to be a personal friend of Julian Harvey. When he arrived, he was able to immediately identify the body as that of Julian Harvey. On the dresser in the room was a 2-page suicide note addressed to a longtime Army friend of Harvey's, a man named James Boozer.
Damn,
In the rambling notes, Harvey asked Boozer to look after his son and ensure that he was buried at sea. The bottom of the letter was signed with, "I got too tired and nervous. I couldn't stand it any longer," and that was it. Even more confusing was that there was no explanation or mention of the Bluebell. The only person who could give them answers now was Terry Jo, once she was well enough to talk. And 2 days after she was found, this is the story that she told. On the last day, on the day of the storm, Terry Jo went to her cabin to go to bed at around 9 p.m. A few hours later, she woke up to the sound of her brother screaming for their dad for help. Then the scream stopped, and she heard a distinct thumping outside of her door. Despite being petrified, she somehow managed to muster up the courage to leave her cabin. She walked by her younger sister Renee's bed, and she wasn't in it, and then she climbed up onto the bridge and found the bloody bodies of her mother and brother. In a panic, she immediately ran away from the bodies, only to run directly into Harvey. He was carrying a bucket and looked furious, and after crying out to him, asking what had happened, he turned to face her and screamed at her to get back to her cabin. Terry Jo ran back to her cabin and tried her best to make herself hidden, but it was difficult in the little room. About 15 minutes later, Harvey burst in holding a rifle. He stared at her for a second and then walked off without saying a word. Still petrified, not wanting to move a muscle, she started to smell something burning and water rushed along the floor in her cabin. Then she ran out of her cabin once again after Harvey and asked him if they were sinking. Harvey said yes and then threw her a rope attached to the dinghy and told her to hold it. She fumbled it and then they watched as the dinghy started to float away. Harvey then dove in after the dinghy, leaving Terry Jo on the now sinking Bluebell, hoping that she would sink along with it. But, thinking quickly, she grabbed a life ring and then ran up to the cabin to grab the life raft that she was later found in. In her statement, Terry Jo was adamant that the weather was clear the entire time. And given the rest of the information, although she never actually witnessed Harvey kill anyone, it's pretty clear that he was directly responsible for the events that unfolded that night.
That is fucking
The question
wild.
that remained was why a decorated war veteran like Julian Harvey would have done something so horrible.
Right.
After a lengthy investigation, this is what they discovered. During World War II, the United States Army needed new planes more capable than their existing B-17s. The solution was the B-24. It was designed with the hope of being better than the notorious Flying Fortress, but unfortunately, it was super heavy and riddled with problems. Pilots found it difficult to fly, and even more seriously, it had a tendency to break apart when landing in the water. It would then promptly sink, and a quarter of all the crew would drown, as was the case with 32 of 50 that had had water landings. This was obviously an unacceptable situation, so the Army turned the plane over to NASA's predecessor, NACA, to work out some of the design problems. The first thing that they would need to do is land one in water and then analyze the wreckage. So they took a B-24, painted it yellow in specific areas to highlight some of the problem areas, welded some steel plates to an area on the underbelly, and named it the Ellie Mae. Next, they found 2 men to crew the plane. The pilot chosen was Major Julian Harvey, and the co-pilot was Carl Green. Harvey had already distinguished himself as an excellent pilot by that point, so he was seen as the perfect choice. Their mission would be to pilot the Ellie Mae into the James River in an area shallow enough to retrieve the wreckage easily. Then on the morning of September 20th, 1944, a crowd gathered around the river to watch the event. Despite the weather being foggy that morning, Harvey and Green reassured officials that the mission would still go off without a hitch. They donned football-style helmets for protection and then took off from the runway in the Ellie Mae. At around noon, they arrived at the river and throttled back the engines to just 100 miles per hour, barely enough to keep a B-24 in the air. Harvey then brought the plane down over the river, letting the tail down first before bringing the entire aircraft down in the water. The plane would skid for another 435 feet through the water before finally stopping. The final speed on impact was 97 miles per hour with a deceleration force of 2.6 Gs. And, as with most of the B-24s, the Ellie Mae was mostly destroyed on impact.
That would hurt.
Despite the crowd's anxiety, the hatch on the plane's roof swung open and out climbed Harvey and Green. Each dry and unharmed, the crowd erupted in cheers. The test was a success. However, following the crash, there seemed to be a change in Harvey. Green later testified that the impact was incredibly fierce, and there's speculation that this affected Harvey. Personality changes are not unheard of following severe head trauma, and the once carefree Harvey developed a dark side. He also developed a stutter that became more prominent in stressful situations. And following the crash, Harvey's personal life seemed to fall apart as well.
Damn.
5 years later, in 1949, while driving his second wife and her mother, he inexplicably lost control of the car, which then plummeted off a cliff. Harvey managed to jump out at the last second and survived relatively unscathed. Unfortunately, both his wife and her mother died in the crash. Shortly after that, Harvey was cleared of any wrongdoing, and the crash was determined to be an accident. Then in 1955, Harvey and a group of friends were sailing his 60-foot sailboat when it ran aground on a sunken World War I vessel. This happened despite his friends repeatedly warning him about the sunken vessel. Harvey claimed he was trying to get close to a buoy to read the writing on it and accidentally ran aground in the process. He and the crew managed to send out a distress signal before evacuating the boat, and everyone else escaped unharmed. Harvey would also receive a $14,000 settlement for the accident.
What?
In 1958, Harvey was medically discharged from the Army. And
so he's just got all these weird, like he's just finding himself either in weird situations where he can like take advantage of it, whether it be to let out some sort of aggression by people dying or him winning a bunch of money and shit for doing stupid shit. Like something is fucking unloose, and he's just like, oh, like, you know, like how a kid when they do something, if they get rewarded for it, you know, they're gonna try to repeat it. You know, animals do the same shit, and when you get in trouble for doing something, you tend to not try to do that shit again. You know what I'm saying? Like he's like got like his reward factors or receptors like firing off every time he does something fucking
life would become
wild.
Even more tumultuous after that. Around the same time, he and his then fifth wife divorced, with her claiming that he was frequently unfaithful and she couldn't tolerate his secret anger anymore. Without the steady pay he was receiving in the Army, and with him being unable to hold down a job, he was also drowning in debt. Following the divorce, Harvey told his friends that he needed a vacation to regroup, so he planned to sell his 80-foot yawl, the Valiant, from Florida to Cuba and then back. But, inexplicably, the boat caught fire and sank about 10 miles off the coast. Miraculously, once again, Harvey escaped unharmed and made it safely back to shore. He then went on to collect a $40,000 insurance settlement for the incident. Shortly after that, while walking the beaches of Florida, he met a woman named Mary Dean. 10 years younger than Harvey, she was immediately taken aback by his war stories, his physique, and charisma. They quickly fell for each other and almost immediately got married in July of 1961.
Damn, that's fast.
This honeymoon period wouldn't last long, however, because
This
soon
nigga
after their
quit.
marriage, Mary Dean learned the truth about his debt and his financial problems.
Yeah, and the fact that
Up
he's
until
like
then,
sixth wife.
Harvey had claimed to be extremely wealthy from all of his military work. Then in September of that
Bro, that is so crazy. And the thing that's so sad is like, even being a decorated officer or, just uh military, personnel in any capacity, like to make a career out of it, there's people who come out on the other side who are doing really well for themselves. But there's a lot more people who go into the military in any branch and find themselves in like really hard situations after the military because they get so comfortable and so ingrained in this like military lifestyle that it's super hard to like come out of it and be a productive member of society on just a regular civilian level. You know what I'm saying? Like they didn't live like a civilian for so long that it's super hard to make that transition. All the PTSD, all the things that just kind of happen to these soldiers during their stints. It's very terrible. But more, I feel like that's why we see such a crazy homeless population of vets, is because most of them aren't capable of being financially stable after the military. Unfortunately, the military needs to teach financial like understanding to their people, so when people leave, they have a better situation. You know what I mean? I don't know, man. Something's got to change.
unbeknownst to Mary Dean, Harvey took out a $20,000 insurance policy on his wife that paid out double in the case of accidental death. It seems that even before landing the job on the Bluebell, Harvey was already planning his
He
next
was
insurance
right.
deal. It's thought that Harvey only planned on killing Mary Dean, but one of the Duperraults accidentally stumbled on Harvey midway through the act, making them a witness. Needing to cover his tracks, Harvey then decided he needed to kill the entire family and had to make it look like an accident. After sinking the boat, there would be nothing and no one to disprove his claims. The only reason he hadn't killed Terry Jo was that he was confident she wouldn't survive the sinking anyway. He never expected that she would be able to make it off the Bluebell. Then, once he was rescued, although his claims were incredibly suspicious, there was no one to refute his story.
Right.
For example, the way that he described the mast breaking and then puncturing the boat was highly unlikely. Then there was the squall that no weather stations had forecasted or even observed. Then there was the fact that his lifeboat was filled with supplies, which also seemed unlikely if he was truly rushing off the
Right, yeah, you would.
ship.
What?
Harvey also had no burns or other injuries despite the supposed massive fire. And finally, he was just weirdly calm for someone who had just lost his wife and witnessed the death of an entire family.
Facts.
But despite how far-fetched his story was, police had no other information to go off of. Following the interview, Harvey seemed to think he had gotten away with it and even seemed to be celebrating. At the first hotel on the island, he ordered a nice steak with potatoes, a salad, and a double brandy. Then between 8:30 p.m. and midnight, he ordered another 10 double brandies to his room.
10?
One time, while the staff was delivering his drink, they even saw into the room and saw a bunch of money drying out on the bed. Back in Miami, he checked into another hotel using the alias John Monroe and paid in cash. And despite everything, he was so close to getting away with it, if not for 11-year-old Terry Jo.
Right.
From the time the boat sank, she spent over 80 hours at sea without food, water, or shelter, and if she was found just a little bit later, it's likely she would not have survived.
See, that was fate right there. You know what I'm saying? All her mom, her dad, her sister, everybody was like, "Nah, we with you. We about to make sure you get found, girl. You about to ride." You know what I'm saying? The shit sucks, but we about to make sure your ass get there.
Harvey knew that it was all over, and so he lied to detectives to get out of his interview, went back to his room, and then slashed his left thigh, both ankles, and then finally his jugular. Per the request in his letter, Julian Harvey's body was buried at sea, in an area near the same depth as Mary Dean's. As for Terry Jo, following her rescue, she was remarkably calm about the events initially. It wasn't until later that she started to suffer the psychological effects of her ordeal.
Facts.
She would later have an immense fear of the dark and of being alone.
Hell yeah.
She would also return to Wisconsin, where she moved in with her aunt and uncle, and over time, she was able to come to peace about the incident. Today, she is happily married with 3 kids.
Hell yeah, I'm glad she has a
Hello,
fulfilling
everyone.
life.
My name is Sean, and welcome to Scary Interesting.
That shit
if you made
is
it this far,
fucking
I just
wild.
want to thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video,
That shit is wild, bro. That would be the most terrifying shit ever, to be floating in the middle of the ocean and shit for like not hours, 80 hours. That's like what 4 days, 5 days, like No, no, thank you, bro. I would be, I would have a fear of the dark and water and all that shit too. Like, how would you not? You know what I'm saying? How would you not? Anyways, man, y'all let me know what you thought about that down in the comments below, man. These are definitely, this is a cool little channel. It's called Scary Interesting. So if you guys want to check it out on your own, you know, that's where you go. And yeah, catch you on the next one. Peace.